Good evening, everyone. I'd invite you to go ahead and get a Bible out if you have one with you, or to get one from the pew in front of you, and turn over to Job chapter 36. Job chapter 36. I'm sorry, Job 37. We finished Job 36 last week. Job chapter 37. Last week we had been continuing in the speech that Elihu gave. And Elihu had, towards the end of that chapter, started to talk about a little bit about God's majesty and his glory and exalting him. His goal being to encourage Job to recognize God and God's glory and to have a repentful attitude. So Elihu is explaining the majesty of God as a way to try and humble Job a little bit, to get him to be repentant. And he had started to talk about things like the water cycle and the weather a little bit, which is building up in this theme that we're going to see throughout this entire chapter. So be thinking about that. There's this idea of a storm, which is great because the song we just sang was about storms, right? And so it fits together really nicely. So let's go ahead and read a few verses here, and then we'll discuss. So Job chapter 37, starting in verse 1, it says, "At this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place. Listen closely to the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that goes out from his mouth. Under the whole heaven he lets it loose, and his lightning travels to the end of the earth. After it a voice roars, he thunders with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain the lightning when his voice is heard. God thunders wondrously with his voice, doing great things which we do not comprehend." All right, so starting right off the bat here, in verse 1, Elihu says, "At this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place." When he says "at this," what is he talking about? What is it that causes his heart to tremble and leap from its place?
The power.
Go ahead.
The power of God and his control over the elements.
The power of God and his control over the elements. Matt, what were you going to say?
Well, it's either the subject that he's deciding, now I'm going to talk about storms, or it makes more sense perhaps to think he's talking, and in the midst of his talking, there's this storm. He's like, "At this storm we're all hearing," and then he's sort of commenting about what's going on around him.
Yeah. Think about the last time that you've been in a thunderstorm and one of the blasts was particularly close and you didn't expect it. Does it ever make you jump? Does it startle you? Because you hear the farther off thundering and then the ones right outside of your house. And it makes your heart jump, right? And I think that is what he's talking about. He could be talking about just the subject in general, but I think that Elihu is taking advantage of the fact that there is this approaching storm and this naturally occurring phenomenon that's happening. He's using it to glorify God. Rick?
Yeah, to go along with what y'all are saying, just the last few verses of the previous chapter, he's talking about the lightning and the thunder, and that's what he's talking about. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Matt, did you have more?
And then to spoiler alert, of course, the next chapter is where the Lord speaks.
Right.
He comes out of the whirlwind, out of the storm. So it all fits that context. There's a storm coming.
It really does. And so this is, out of all the things that Elihu says, I think that chapter 37 may be the most spirit-driven, you might say, because the things that he's saying here are really accurate, because he's not really critiquing Job so much here as he's just praising God, right? He's praising God's glory. He's praising God's might. He's talking about this wonderful storm that's happening. And he's saying, look, Job, look at this storm as an example of God's power and his might and his glory, right? Not knowing that God is about to speak out of this storm. Elihu's, if he's not trembling in fear, he's probably thinking, yes, this proves my point, right before God starts talking. But yeah, he's using this and he's talking about God's glory, and you can really sense a difference in his tone, I think, in the passion that he's saying here. Whereas when he starts the speech, he's pretty angry. And here he's just really getting very poetic about the glory of God. So it seems to be a little bit of a change in tone. So he says, listen closely to the thunder of his voice, right? And so he's talking about the thunder and the rumbling that goes out of his mouth. So he's using this idea of the thunder being the sound of God's voice. Can you think of anywhere else in the Bible where thunder is equated to God's voice?
Yes, on the mountain when Moses went up.
On the mountain where Moses went up? Are there any others?
Yes, but I can't remember. I just read today, so.
Matt?
I'm pretty sure there's some symbolism like that in Revelation.
Yeah.
Sounds of many waters.
Yeah, and I know that there are more spread throughout the Bible as well, but those are just a couple that come to mind as some of the times that he has the sound of thunder associated with his voice. There's also, I know that there's one in Psalms, although I forget exactly which Psalm. I want to say it's 77, but I'd have to go back and look.
Psalm 18:13.
Yeah, there you go, Psalm 18:13. So there's lots of places where God's voice is equated with the sound of thunder, right? And he says, under the whole heaven, he lets it loose. In other words, God's voice can be heard everywhere. He says, and his lightning travels to the end of the earth. After it, a voice roars. So thunder comes after lightning. He thunders with his majestic voice. He does not restrain the lightning when his voice is heard. He thunders wondrously with his voice. So you see, again, Elihu is just repeating in multiple ways, God's voice is like thunder, right? God's power is like lightning. These are some of the things that he keeps saying. And consistent with the way that Hebrew poetry works, when you repeat something over and over again, you're emphasizing that idea. So that is just how it worked in Hebrew poetry. And so that is what Elihu is doing. He's being very poetic as he describes God's voice. So then in verse 6, he says, for to the snow, he says, fall on the earth. And to the downpour and the rain, he says, be strong. He seals the hand of every person so that all people may know its work. Then the animal goes into its lair and it remains in its den. Okay, so someone explain what these few verses mean then. Paraphrase that. Why does he start talking about rain and snow and then, people in their work and animals in their dens or their lairs? What's that about? Matt?
It seems to be just like the different seasons. There's time for snow and there's time for rain. And then people maybe can't even get out if it's a snowstorm.
Yeah.
So you're going to be sealing your home because it's not time.
Yeah. When he's talking about sealing up the hand of every person, their work, it was difficult for them to work in the rain and the snow. Even in modern times, it can be very difficult for us to work in the rain and the snow. And so the point here that Elihu is stressing is that, God is in control of the weather. God is in control of the storm. And this dominates the will of man. God's will is superseding the will of man. Man wants to get out there and work and do man's plans, and God's will takes precedence over that, right? And the same goes with animals for the rest of the natural world. In verse 8, talking about the animals go into their lair. The animals go in during that weather. In verse 9, it says, from the south comes the storm, and from the north wind the cold. From the breath of God ice is made, and the expanse of the waters is frozen. He also loads clouds with moisture. He disperses the cloud of his lightning. It changes direction, turning around by his guidance, that it may do whatever he commands it on the face of the inhabited earth. Whether for correction or for his earth or for goodness, he causes it to happen. Okay, so he had... Oh, go ahead, Rick.
Sorry, weird thing. Did they really know scientifically that the clouds, water was condensed into the clouds? Or
I don't know.
Is this just God telling them this?
I would imagine that they had no way of knowing that for sure other than God imparting this wisdom to them. And then later, with science, we see that that is in fact true,
We
right?
kind of proved it later, but
Yeah.
that's what I was thinking. Like the only reason they know some of the things they know is because God gave them.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the remarks that Job had in previous chapters, Job would have had no way of knowing beyond hearing it from God, right? The science for that sort of thing didn't exist at the time. And then as science develops, it simply confirms what the Bible's already told us.
Yep.
Matt.
Not to discount all of that, but there would have been a sense in which regular people would have associated those clouds with rain. And so there would have been some, they wouldn't have had all the scientific knowledge to know precisely how that happened.
Sure.
But there would have been like, hey, there's never any clouds, and then now there's a drought or whatever.
Right.
So there'd be some connection they would have had.
No, that's a good point. I think that one of the most interesting verses in this chapter, in my opinion, is verse 12, right? So I think, Matt, it was you last week who made mention of something like this. Or maybe it was Kim. Somebody mentioned that not only is God in the storm, but God has control over the storm. Was that you, Kim? Yeah. And this is exactly what Elihu is expressing here, right? It's not just that God is in the storm, that God creates the storm, but God controls the storm. Look at what he says the storm is made for. Elihu says in verse 13, he doesn't actually know what the storm's purpose is. He just says, whether it's for correction, so, whether this storm is sent as a punishment on someone, or whether it's for his earth, meaning for the benefit of the land, right, watering the land, or for goodness, whether it's to benefit somebody, maybe they need water for their crops, he causes it to happen. So for whatever reason God puts the storm in the sky, he causes it to happen. This storm is under his control at all times. Any thoughts or questions or comments on that verse?
He uses all that he has in his
Mhm.
power to complete his purposes, whatever it is that he intends to do.
Yeah.
And if that is to punish or to show goodness, he does that.
Yeah, I think that this is also interesting because, there are a lot of times when you might see God's hand in something in the way that circumstances work out for you, whereas someone else would just be like, well, that wasn't God. That storm just happened to roll over you, or something like that. You caught a lucky break because, this storm blew by and watered your crops for you or whatever. Or, you see so many people strive to find some natural phenomenon to explain something that happens in the Old Testament, for example. Oh, well, this just happened to happen. It wasn't God. It was just this naturally occurring phenomenon. Not understanding that behind all the naturally occurring phenomenon is God, right? That God controls everything, right? God controls the storm. So God doesn't have to just reach down with his hand and directly do something to cause it to happen. He can use one of his tools should he so desire, right? The end effect is the same. He gets done what he wants done, but the method he may use differs. And that's one of the wonderful things that we see about God. We see that reflected in the character of Jesus as well. Think about the different ways that Jesus healed people, right? There were some times when Jesus didn't even have to be near the person, and he would just say that they're healed, and then later others would find out that they were in fact healed at that very time, right? There were other times that he would pray with them and they would be healed. Sometimes he would heal them with a touch. And there was the one time where he mixes mud and spit together and puts it on someone's eyes, right? Showing you that God is not bound by one method the way that man is, right? When man wants to do something, typically we have one or two ways of doing a thing. God can accomplish things however he chooses, right? And so we see that reflected not only in God's character, but in Jesus also being the Son of God. So, go ahead, Kim.
When we think about Moses going into Pharaoh, and all he had was the staff in his hand, and he said, what's that in your hand? God used that staff to do a lot of things.
Yeah.
Change to a snake and all that, and then hit the rock or water, and there was a lot of uses for that. And when we think about Jesus coming out on the stormy sea, walking on the water, and coming to the apostles there, did he just take advantage of that storm?
Mm-hmm.
Happen naturally, or it makes you stop and think.
Yeah. So it's just a good lesson for all of us and a good application to remember not to respect the creation more than the creator, right? That God has power above that which he's created. And so to respect him as the one behind that natural world. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next verse? Judy, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that God and his works are in more things in our lives than we ever have any idea.
Of course, yeah.
I have seen it myself dozens of times. It just, he was there.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so then in verse 14, so this whole time Elihu has been speaking about the glory of God. He has been speaking to Job, but it sounds like he's kind of just been waxing a little bit poetical here. But then in verse 14, he kind of addresses or readdresses Job. He says, listen to this, Job. Stand and consider the wonders of God, right? So he kind of brings it back to Job and gets his attention again. And he says, do you know how God establishes them? Talking about the wonders of God. Do you know how God establishes them and makes the lightning of his clouds to shine? Do you know about the hovering of the clouds? The wonders of the one who is perfect in knowledge? You whose garments are hot when the land is still because of the south wind? Can you, with him, spread out the skies, strong as a cast metal mirror? Teach us what we are to say to him. We cannot present our case because of darkness. So now, I think that this is really interesting because, spoiler, when God starts talking, he addresses Job with this onslaught of questions, right? So I think all of us are pretty familiar with Job 38. When God starts talking, he's going to ask Job this series of questions. And so a lot of, do you know this? Or do you know how this happens? Or whatever. And Elihu's kind of doing the same thing right here. It's like a little miniature prelude to that, right? And so he's asking Job, do you know how these things happen? Do you know the way that these things work? Right? And he kind of sums that up in verse 19. So, teach us what to say to God then. If you know these things, if you know how all these things work, then tell us what we're to say to God, right? And of course, the implication being what? Job doesn't actually know these things, right? Kim?
It's as if Elihu is accusing Job of being equal to God.
Mm-hmm.
I have a problem with that.
Well, I think that remember the way that Job ended his speech. How did he end Job's speech? Does anybody remember? You don't have to have the exact words, but in general, how did Job wrap up his speech?
He was begging for help, someone to plead his case, and
So at the very end of Job's speech, when he kind of says, in essence, like, here I sign my name, right? These are my words. This is my statement. Let the Almighty hear me. He's really, the tone that he takes there and the language he uses is very demanding. He's demanding that God answer him. Before, he had been lamenting to God, crying out, asking, saying, I'm confused. I don't understand what's happening. I'm in misery. I'm in despair. I'm in pain. He had been making statements about how he feels and how he's sad and all these things. But it wasn't until the end when he demanded to speak to God. Before, he was kind of using hypothetical situations like, well, if I had the chance to present my case to God, this is what I might do, right? But at the end, he demands an answer from God. And I think that more than anything is probably what set Elihu off, because he was patient and listened throughout the entire conversation previously. But I think that it was things like that in Elihu's mind reinforced that Job was arrogant, that Job thought he might be the equal to God, or that, he had a right to say those things. And so I'm pretty sure that it would have been the end of Job's speech that really just got under Elihu's skin more than anything else. What do you think? Anybody disagree?
No.
All right. So in in verse 20, it says, "Shall it be told to him that I would speak? Or should a or should a man say that he would be swallowed up? Now people do not see the light which is bright in the skies, but the wind has passed and cleared them. From the north comes golden splendor. Around God is awesome majesty. The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is exalted in power, and he will not violate justice and abundant righteousness. Therefore, people fear him. He does not regard any who are wise of heart." And that actually brings Elihu's entire speech to a conclusion, right? So first, let's just say, what is he getting at the end here? So he basically says to Job, does any human really have a right to demand anything of God? But then he starts once again kind of talking about nature and the sky. He says, the Almighty, we cannot find him. What does he mean by that? Can you find God?
He's beyond our reach. We can't drag him into a courtroom, so to speak.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
That's kind of what Job was asking for, if you remember, too. So.
Yeah. Because, people talk about finding Jesus, right, or finding God, and they're talking in a spiritual sense, right? They found God's word. They've come to the realization that Jesus is the Son of God. God is the Almighty, and they need to correct their lives, right? We can find God in that sense. But to Rick's point, we can't physically demand that God come to the place that we are so that we can address him. It doesn't work that way, right? God cannot be found in such a manner. And he also says he will not violate justice and abundant righteousness. What do you think about that statement? Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I believe that's his nature. Yeah, he would not go against justice.
Yeah, God's unchanging, right? And God's law is justice, right? God teaches us what justice is, not the other way around, right? And righteousness, yeah. So what God said is righteousness, and he's not going to violate that. He is the essence of righteousness, right? And because of these things, because God is exalted in power, and he's just, and he's righteous, Elihu says, therefore people fear him. He does not regard any who are wise of heart. And who might he be addressing as potentially being wise of heart? Job, right? Very pretty pointed statement, right? That's not hidden from anybody. So, with that being said, if you back up to when Elihu started talking, right? Job chapter 33. Job chapter 33, at the very beginning, or I'm sorry, even before that, Job chapter 32, I think, is when he starts. Elihu was asking people to listen to him because he said that he was going to argue with arguments that they haven't used before, that he was going to give his share of answers and tell his opinion. How do you think he did over these last 5 chapters? First of all, did Elihu share his opinion?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes, right? So he nailed that one. He did a great job sharing his opinion and his answers. But did he, in fact, put forward answers that the other 3 friends did not propose? So Eliphaz, right? Bildad, Zophar, they had been talking to Job several times and kind of rehashing the same 1 or 2 points. Did Eliphaz actually bring up anything new, or did he just restate those same arguments, but with different words? What do you think?
Other than the praise of God and this about God being unreachable, teachable and who are we to teach God or whatever. Seems like he said the same things in the end to me. That's
Yeah. Anybody else? Out of the whole thing, I think that the only thing that Elihu might have said that was mildly different was that he was saying that pain and suffering could also be used as an instruction tool and not just as a punishment. The other three friends had been saying pain and suffering are punishments. The things that Job is enduring are punishments. And Elihu was saying that they can be punishments, but they can also be teaching tools, right? They can be a chastisement meant to turn you to repentance to avoid a worse fate. Really, he's just building upon what the friends have said, taking it one more step, but it is slightly different. But I think beyond that, I think that the majority of everything that Elihu has said over these last 5 chapters has not varied all that much. I really do think that last chapter, chapter 37, was probably the most inspired sounding chapter, and that's because he's praising God, and he's using this example of this approaching storm. He's got an actual physical example of a thing to talk about and point to and use as praise towards God. And so I think that is probably the best point he made in the entire time, right? And again, whenever we're studying these things, we want to think of just a couple high-level ideas, right? The first being who's saying what and why are they saying it, right? So it was Elihu speaking, and he's trying to drive his friend to repentance because he thinks his friend is being arrogant after being sinful, and he wants his friend to be saved, right? So we want to consider what's being said, and we want to consider why it's being said in the right context. But then we also want to think about application, right? A lot of the Old Testament is for our history, for our learning. It provides context for us so we can interpret God's word in the proper light. But there are also lessons all throughout it for us, right? So out of all these conversations with Job's friends, with Elihu, I'm looking for 3 applications of how you might use any of this in your own life. So 3 applications. Can anybody think of any?
You're asking 3 applications of like lessons from the fact that we heard all these speeches.
Mm-hmm. This is a really open-ended one. There's not really wrong answers.
Yeah. The big lesson I get is it's so easy to think you know the Word of God, and so you know how it is, and you know everyone's situation, and you assume and judge too much when you really don't know everything.
Yeah, I would say that is one of the key themes that we've seen is that making assumptions, hasty assumptions, can wreck what is otherwise very sound and reasonable logic, right? If you build a case against someone because you're making one bad assumption about them, and you think that they're at fault when they're really not, it throws off everything else that you're doing, right? These friends were speaking with proverbs and with ancient wisdom, but they were off base because they had falsely assumed things about Job. So that's a great one. One of the ones that I see is along similar lines, but it's compassion, right? We're told that when we correct someone that we're to correct them with passion, right? Now, Elihu was passionate, but not compassionate, right? He was very, very wound up and full of righteous anger. He just couldn't wait to put forward his opinions and ideas. He couldn't even hold it in anymore. But it was because he wanted to correct someone so badly, rather than with compassion. Now, he did want his friend to repent, right? But it was this idea of compassion. And I know that in Revelation, you talked at the beginning about the churches that needed correction, right? You remember there was one church that had lost its first love, right? When we lose love when we stop caring about God or caring about each other, when we are just, coldly, robotically following rules and laws, and we forget that there's a soul in that body that we're talking to, we lose something, right? We are instructed by Jesus to talk compassionately to one another, right? So that was a key takeaway for me. We have time for one more lesson that anybody felt like they got out of that. Rick.
I felt like they got, part of the reason it kind of went downhill was they got kind of frustrated and became impatient. You notice they showed up and they sat in silence for a week, which did show a great amount of caring and compassion and
absolutely
feeling for Job. But then I think they got frustrated and maybe lost some patience with him. Something we can watch out for there, just in general.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good one because it shows a good way to handle things and a bad way to handle things. And that can be done by the same person, right? You can start out solid in your approach with your friend, and as your emotions ramp up, it can all fall apart on you, right? You can start out really strong in the way that you're helping someone, and then that can spiral out of control if you let it, right? So I think that's a great example.
Well, sometimes, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sometimes when you want someone to change, when you really know that they are doing wrong, but they just presume that Job had done wrong.
Yeah.
But when we think of someone doing wrong and know that they're doing, we start out and we want them to change and we want them to be different. Sometimes we start out real mild and gentle and loving, and when they get a little bit, I don't want to change, I'm not going to change, we get out of control. Then we lose them and us.
Yeah. Matt?
Continuing on the theme of we don't know everything, just like how the friends didn't really know the situation with Job and they assumed. Job didn't really know why God was doing this.
Yeah.
Like, jump to John 9, the man that was born blind. Why was this man born blind? Because someone sinned. Because so the glory of God would be shown in him. And it's kind of the same lesson here.
It really is,
as difficult as that fact is.
Yeah. Okay, so now next week we're going to dive into Job 38. Now that's where the blue book picks up. It doesn't sound like a lot of people are like super eager to go back to it. I will probably still look through there for additional questions, but I think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to start trying to kind of give you guys an outline of what I want to go over in the coming week. And that way it gives you a little something to prepare along the lines of. So when we get into Job chapter 38, my plan is as God asks Job questions, I want us to try and answer those questions as well. Think about the questions that Job is asking God and put yourself in Job's shoes or in your own shoes as humans, several thousand years later with a lot of scientific knowledge. Can you answer those questions, right? So I want us to think about that as one thing. I want you to think about the way that God has these questions grouped, right? I think you're going to see that there are some common themes within groups of questions. So think about that. And then finally, at the end of chapter 38, think about why is God asking Job all of these questions? What is the lesson that God is trying to teach? So that's your homework for next week. So try and answer the questions, try and see if you can group the questions into themes, and then try to figure out what is the lesson that that God is trying to teach to Job. All right? Thank you, everyone.
So if we'll just take a few minutes this evening to look in Esther. I'm going to be looking primarily at Esther chapter 4. But in Esther chapter 3, the king there decides to allow the destruction of all the Jews, basically allow Haman to kill all of them. He gives him the authority to kill every one of them. And Mordecai is trying to convince Esther to intercede with the king to stop Haman or to spare and save the Jews. So if we look at Esther chapter 4, verses 10 through 16, then Esther spoke to Hathach, and I'm probably not saying that right, I think it's Hathach, and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king, who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. So she felt that if she went in unsummoned, that she would be killed, because that was the law, that was the rule. And even though she was the queen, that was his rule for everyone. So continuing on in verse 13, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Now Mordecai had faith and told her that God will deliver his people, even if she did nothing, even if she doesn't help. But he also warned her that she would not escape destruction by doing nothing. So then he says something different, and different translations, that last line in verse 14, different translations say it a little different, but just kind of paraphrase it. Who knows, perhaps you have come to your position as the queen for such a time as this, to be able to save the people. In other words, perhaps this is God's providence at work. So then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So God gave Esther this opportunity. She could have missed it due to fear, and her fear was very valid. That was the law. She could be killed. But Esther was brave, and she took a chance in faith, believing in God. Even though she knew she was risking her life, she still did it. She was given this opportunity to do good with her position and her influence. It was a chance to save her people, and in the end, she did. We know that she went in, and she was successful, and the Jews were saved, and she did not die. We know that's the way it went. And that's a good example for us, even in just every day. We need to make sure that we do not miss our opportunities, the times when we can do good for others, when we can serve the Lord in some way and maybe make a real difference in life. Don't let our fears or doubts keep us from doing what God has put us here to do. God guides us so that we are in the right place at the right time. We just may not know it. So we need to remember that we are also a part of God's providence, a part of his plan. He has put us where we are with whatever abilities we have, and we can make a difference and accomplish something for the Lord and for others. Do not let fears or doubts or insecurities keep us from our opportunities to serve him. Trust that God has us in the right place where we need to be, and that he can use us for good, for his plan. If we look at Proverbs chapter 3, verses 27 and 28, he tells us, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in the power of your hand to do so. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come back, and tomorrow I will give it, when you have it with you. So we don't want to miss the chance. The time, again, is always now. It's never later. And the same goes for salvation or forgiveness. If we know we need those things, we do not want to wait. Ask the Lord to forgive, and he is faithful and just to forgive us. And we're here now if anyone did need baptism for salvation or anything that we can help you with tonight. Now we have an opportunity for any who has a need. And if there's anything we can do that we can help you with, please come forward as we stand and sing.